the aging process is so very real, and it's facing us. We're seeing it in the world. And at one point in time, we were young and we got older. And I think we all remember the riddle of the Sphinx, what walks in the morning on 4 legs, at noon on 2, and the evening on 3, and then on no legs in the at night. And it's humankind, mankind. And so the aging process occurs. We have to be aware of that. And the question is, how do we add health to our years? It's not just about, well, I made it to a certain age, but it's that younger biological age. And that'll be really the focus of our conversation today is what can we do? And also as functional medicine, forward-thinking providers, have there been common themes that we've been implementing in our practice, but have they really all been tying into the mitochondria and supporting certain pathways? And I think the answer is yes, invariably. So with that, if we look at my next slide, you'll see the topics of the day. And the topics of the day here are that we're going to support the body from a nicotinamide riboside perspective, but we're going to be supporting our pathways, our mitochondrial pathways. And think for a moment, all of us, as we ponder, like, do we wake up tired today? Do we wake up with an ache or pain? Definitely our patients do, because they come in sick and tired of being sick and tired. But how many cells in the body have to be tired before we perceive it? And how many cells in the body have to hurt? And we can say, well, it's a certain number. It's a big number for pain, for example. But then we think about if we get a paper cut, the paper cut can hurt worse than cutting ourselves with a kitchen knife while we're cutting our carrots and lettuce. Or we can go ahead and get a little splinter, and a little splinter can hurt more than a big splinter. So there's still a grand mystery of the human body as well. So we're going to learn a lot about nicotinamide riboside. We're going to learn a lot about the mitochondria as well, and how do we support the body from a foundational perspective. And so NAD and NAD homeostasis is very real. They've done studies showing that in human skin, by the mid-40s, we have about 50% of our NAD levels. So how do we support that? We support that with nicotinamide riboside. We'll go through some pathways as to why that's preferential and why I've chosen to, after reviewing all the clinical literature, use it in my clinical practice as well. But we often measure red blood cell life, and we look at a red blood cell, we say, well, it lives 90 to 120 days. And what do? We measure A1C. We see how much damage has occurred to the hemoglobin over that period of time. Well, likewise, with the skin aging, NAD levels drop. Well, the skin replaces itself, the outer layer, about every 27 days. So once again, seeing that NAD levels are dropping in skin, we're seeing ATP levels dropping throughout our body over the course of time. It's like, oh my goodness. So now you should all see a slide that says, what is NAD? And NAD, of course, coenzyme. We know that. We learned that back in basic sciences. But here's a 2021 article talking about NAD. It's like, but it's kind of old news. It's becoming more and more contemporary news. Just like we all fell in love about 20 years ago with vitamin D. We all knew it was important, and we really knew it was important. Well, we're really knowing that supporting NAD levels is absolutely critical. And so I use it in my clinical practice. I personally take it. And of course, when we're fighting off a virus or an illness, we want to crank up our NAD levels. But we're supporting so many different pathways. And we're going to see on one of the peer-reviewed literature articles that we're going to share today, up to 500 different enzyme pathways are NAD dependent. But at the same time, it's helping with sirtuins. Well, think about intermittent fasting. Think about calorie restriction. But how about CD38 and the poly-ADP ribose, the polymerases? And so it's like, wow, there's just all these different things, the PARPs, the CD38s that we're supporting, but they're all NAD dependent. And so when we're looking at healthy aging, once again, we're looking at every organ in our body. We know that when we look into an eye with an ophthalmoscope, we're seeing blood vessels, we're seeing nerves real time. But we also know that those changes in the back of the eye, the window into our soul to speak, but also our vasculature and our nervous system, is really telling us a lot of clues about what's really going on in the entirety of the body. Well, likewise, our skin does. We all read people, even though we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover. If someone's looking ashen or tired or pale, we're like, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and read something into that. So we have to look at the body as a whole, and that's what we do as providers. And that's why we're never going to get replaced by Google. Even though sometimes our patients try to Google us or out-Google us, the reality is we are absolutely critical. So when we look at this lovely little pathway to make NAD, and we're going to show how both proteins and carbs and fats and even their dietary utilization in the citric acid cycle and electron transport chain are all dependent upon multiple nutrients. But we might remember back in that nutrition class, and before I became a naturopathic physician, I took a couple of years of allopathic medical school, did my basic sciences, and I had that classical nutrition class between 88 and 90. And it was basically the vitamins, kwashiorkor, marasmus. But we learned that 30 to 60 milligrams of tryptophan is made into merely 1 little milligram of niacin. That's a de novo pathway. It's very inefficient, but it's built into our body for a reason. Then we can go from the niacin and we can go down all these pathways, all requiring coenzymes. And once again, lack of polymorphisms that might skew it, or we can go through the salvage pathway. So we have the de novo pathway, we have the Priest-Handler pathway, but the salvage pathway is where nicotinamide riboside comes in. And when we're under demand, physiological stress, psychological stress, viral impact, the NRK pathway is stimulated to actually convert the NR into the NAD pathway. So once again, you can eat all the turkey in the world, you can have all the niacin in the world, but it has to go through all these different pathways. And once again, as you can see here, 60 milligrams of tryptophan can synthesize 1 milligram of niacin. But why would our bodies have a biochemical pathway that is that A, amazing, but B, that inefficient? A 60-to-1 ratio, or even if we were conservative, 30-to-1 ratio is like, okay, so our body thinks that niacin is important. Well, our body thinks vitamin D is important. Once again, we go ahead and produce that as well. So anything we make, I always tell my patients, if your body's making CoQ10, if your body's making NAD, if your body's making PQQ, pyroquinone and quinone, it's like, yeah, let's vote for that. Just like the endocannabinoid system. If our body makes it, it's probably not a bad thing to replicate and mimic that pathway. And so what's interesting is nicotinic acid deficiency was known way back in the 1700s. And we know that any vitamin, to be a vitamin, has to have a deficiency state associated with it. When I learned it, it was the 4 Ds. Sometimes they say the 3 Ds, but it's diarrhea, dementia, death. It's like, like, okay, well, we don't want any of those Ds. And so once again, we want to look at, this is what happens when our body starts winding down with the niacin over just plain old niacin, not NAD. You can only imagine now you go down multiple other steps, what's going to happen. So what happens when we're tired? What happens when our brain's tired? What happens when our patients say, Doc, I think I have chronic fatigue syndrome, or I think I have a neurological issue, or my heart is heavy and I think I might have congestive heart failure. Well, I've had patients with congestive heart failure with ejection fractions of 17%. Thanks to natural medicine and supporting diet and lifestyle, we've gotten them back up to the normal range of ejection fraction. And once again, individual results will vary, but the reality is we are supporting the cellular energy within our body. We're also supporting, when we support the mitochondria, we're supporting the gonads. I've had men and women alike that have premature gonadal failure. They are 40 years old, male, 20 or 25-year-old, 30-year-old men and women that are having unusual periods, atypical periods. I've had women late 30s, early 40s, total cessation of their periods and going into menopause prematurely. So you have to wonder what's really going on. And most of us in clinical practice, we've been doing it for a while, have seen a lot more fatty liver being diagnosed on ultrasounds as well. Once again, a reflection of the mitochondria. So when we focus on immune, we focus on inflammatory pathways, homeostasis, our hormonal entity. After all, we all know the theory, neuroendocrine theory of aging. Our gonadally, our hormones go down, well, we're going to start aging. Our adrenals are waxing and waning. We're going to have breakthrough inflammation because we're not making that 20 to 25 milligrams of hydrocortisone daily. Or our thyroid, with all the gluten and celiac awareness, we hear a lot about Hashis. Of course, the now new popular term for the term Hashimoto's. Do you have Hashis? And it's just a conversation at the cafe, but we know that is also part and parcel. But the thyroid is our human metronome. We know that. Basal body temperatures, how well we're working. We know all the classical signs of hypothyroidism. And that includes constipation, dry skin, slower thinking, depression, onwards and onwards, and often elevated liver enzymes, elevated lipids. But we want to look at how do we repair. So we're going to get into all of that, realizing that it's a summation of our genetic potential. So I often give the example at this juncture with a patient of mine. I'll hold up my iPhone, and I don't work for iPhone. And it's like, okay, well, how good is my iPhone? If it has no battery charge, it's $1,000 paperweight. And so I tell them the apps on my phone are like your DNA. And that DNA is part and parcel, has to have the battery charge. So how good is our genes? Only as good as the cellular charge in the gonads, in the adrenals, in the thyroid, in our immunological capacity. Hence I put, we're a summation, the sigma notation of all our parts, but down to the mitochondria, which of course are in every one of our eukaryotic cells. So we have the aging process that accelerates the mitochondrial dysfunction. We have, of course, primary mitochondriopathies. I've had a couple patients overtly diagnosed by their allopathic physicians with mitochondriopathy. We support those individuals. But then we have illnesses, stressors, hypoxia, lifestyle, and of course, various medications, which we'll go over today. We'll discuss medications as well as some procedures that also alter the mitochondria. So are our patients charged up? And the answer is no, but they're not charged up. And think about how we all were in 2019. Remember those good old days? Then we had 2020. We have now 2021. We're almost through all of 2021. We had extra stressors, extra worries, extra turmoil in the world. And I think most people that are seeing patients regularly, either through Zoom, which of course isn't the same as sitting in a room, or in person, you're seeing more anxiety, more depression, more somatic physical symptomologies that are often now being fed by psychological issues that never existed for those individuals. People are feeling a little squirrely, and I love squirrels. I'm not picking on squirrels. And so once again, we have the cell phone example. One of the things I was taught when I was in conventional medical school was from our professor, which was associate professor, as well as the associate dean. And he says, I could bring in a plumber and I could bring in an electrician, and she or he can teach you how to wire or plumb a house. However, if they're good, you'll know how to wire and plumb a house. If not, you'll hear how they do it. So converting things into understandable terms, the charging up, or the cell, before we call them smartphones, the cell, and the apps as the DNA. It's like, wow, okay, if I don't have a charge on my cells, human cells, trillions of cells, whether it be GI, thyroid, we're not going to have functionality. And so it really gets people to buy into the concept of how do I fuel my DNA for maximum performance. And of course, we know the basic cellular function. I just put this up here as a humble reminder of what we learned when we were in undergraduate, what we learned while we were taking biochemistry and physiology classes, and also histology. Then we're like, but now all of a sudden it has a clinical relevance. And if only we had that clinical relevance while we were learning all the hard sciences, we were like, darn, it would have been a lot more interesting. Of course, it was already fascinating, but it would have been a lot more interesting knowing that we need to have mitochondrial function, we need to have NAD to fuel the cells, the tissues, the organs, organ systems, and of course, us, the organism. So if we think about the journey of all the people which we stand on the shoulders of, the women and men, the people that came before us, well, Altman identified bioblasts, which were basically mitochondria and cytoplasmic structures. And then in 1898, Benda actually coined the term mitochondria. And then in the 1930s, there was a respiratory chain that came around, then the respiratory enzymes, and Warburg won the Nobel Prize for that. And the Nobel Prize was awarded to Krebs cycle. We call it now the TCA or citric acid cycle. But it's like, darn, we stand on the shoulders. And if it wasn't for those individuals doing their work, and likewise in our clinical practices, some of us are the pioneers begging the question, furthering functional medicine. So my hat is off to each of you. So we have embryonic mitochondria. Thanks to mom and mom's mom, and of course the mother's lineage, we have our mitochondria. Then life happens, and oh boy, does life happen. And so once again, then we get damaged mitochondria, and then whatever our functionality was before modern life, westernized world, epidemics, pandemics, and cellular phones, 5G, whatever you want to think about. Okay, well, now we have damaged mitochondria. And so with that damaging process, whether it be not eating enough antioxidants, living in a big city with lots of free radicals and benzenes and toluenes, or just inflammation, the aging process, we're starting to have mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is where we end up in the NAD conversation. So we remember the Krebs cycle, and we know that we all need some degree of carbs to live, unless you're a really efficient keto person. And we see that NAD levels drop with aging. And if you look here at everywhere the little star pops up, it's an NAD-dependent enzyme. So glucose can't go to pyruvate, and pyruvate can't go down to acetyl-CoA without NAD. And if you have insufficient NAD, you might actually start having lactate buildup. And for those of you that do the organic acid profile tests, often called also the OAT test, you measure these markers all the time. I do as well. And you're like, darn, NAD, look at all over the place. But more importantly, look at that citric acid cycle. Once again, how are we going to create all those molecules of ATP if we don't have NAD? And it's our rate limiting factor. Remembering in the skin, by the 40s, we have about half of what we had when we were younger. And so all of this inefficiency occurs, including the the oxidase of phosphorylation. And we're like, okay, we need NAD. So that's a given. We kind of know that. We described how the body makes it inefficiently from tryptophan, how you can take niacin, but once again, inefficient. And lots of different approaches have been proposed out in the marketplace of take this, and somehow you'll magically make it. But remember, each of these little enzyme pathways, including also the enzyme pathways for tryptophan and niacin and so forth, to be made into NAD are dependent upon other nutrients. And we all have learned with the MTHF, the methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, MTHFR, well, if you've got a polymorphism there, your folate is not going to get converted to MTHF. Well, now do the same thing with NAD or B6 or any other nutrient. There's all these polymorphisms to consider, and even though it might look good on paper, you need to have a pathway that works. And sometimes we feel undermotivated. Sometimes that's mental, sometimes that's physical, and sometimes we're exhausted. And it's like, well, I was all ready to go exercise and that ain't happening, emphasis on the word ain't. And it's like, But remember, NAD is critical for brain function, liver, vasculature, our 60,000 miles of blood vessels, our heart. If you have 72 beats per minute, if you do the math real quick, 103,680 times a day, our heart beats with the average pulse of 72 beats. Going through 60,000 miles of blood vessels, our lymphatics, reproductive function, onwards and onwards, including our detox pathways. And once again, lots of toxins in the world. And so when we look at the mitochondrial dysfunction in clinical practice, we're seeing things like autism and Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And if you know this correlation, when you look in the back of the eye, you start seeing macular changes that often can be related to amyloid plaque accumulation in the back of the eye, which often correlates with changes in the brain as well. But look at chronic fatigue, all these developmental delays. When my children, which are 23 and 28, were born, there's about a 1 in 500 chance that they would experience autism. Now it's like 1 in 48 if I had boys again. And it's like, or if they have boys. And of course, if they have girls, it'd be 1 in 145. So it's like something's going on here. So lots of mitochondrial challenges on the Alzheimer's side, the autism side, and I would also argue the attention deficit side, but including fibromyalgia as well. So once again, how many cells before we're tired or we start presenting with symptoms? So when we look at this pathway, if we only had this pathway three-dimensional or brought to life, we see here, we've got our proteins. Well, they have to have all these nutrients, and you'll see B3, if you have really good eyes, several times along the way here. You have your carbs, you have your fats. How many of our patients go onto a diet and they're like, all my friends were doing keto, I just felt terrible on it, or I went vegan, I just can't do it. Well, how well are each of these pathways fueled before you change your diet? If you were just on an omnivore diet, now you shifted all towards one of the three legs of the stool of fueling the citric acid cycle. Often you'll fall short if there's one or more nutrients that are low. And so once again, every place where there's a star, a little blue star, are NAD dependent. And like, okay, well, we have a lot of potential risk factors here. And once again, simple to level the playing field, just like if you didn't know whether a person had a methylene tetrahydrofolate defect, you just give them a vitamin, a multivitamin, or a selective standalone MTHF to cover the bases. Well, why aren't we doing this with NAD since it's so critical for so many pathways? Well, we are. Many of us in functional medicine have now seen the silver lining of just supporting this so we can pass the baton down the energy pathways and then in turn treat the target tissues that our patients came in with: skin problems, brain problems, heart problems, adrenal problems, thyroid problems, gonadal issues, fertility issues are very closely linked. And there's a fertility article I wrote for NDNR about the mitochondria and fertility. Once again, is that one reason we're having so much more infertility as well? And I would argue definitely part of the equation. So then we have sleep apnea. I was diagnosed with sleep apnea when I was $175 and 6'1", and dental procedures, orthodontic work, being a mouth breather, the short straw and genetics, whatever it might be. I have 300-pound truck drivers, and I have 105-pound individuals with equal sleep apnea. So they often say, well, I woke up startled. Yeah, stereotypical cartoonish symptoms. You may not, but lots of times it presents with bowel issues or anxiety or other things because, of course, if you're suffocating, your tissues are not doing well. And I shared the example of putting a rubber band around my finger and expecting the tip of my finger to be thriving. It's not. But we now know that with obstructive sleep apnea, so let's say a patient of yours has been treated for obstructive sleep apnea, and they're currently treated and they're being compliant, which is about 50% of people with obstructive sleep apnea say compliant after 6 months. And so like, okay, well, I'm doing this, but what about the mitochondrial damage and dysfunction that occurred before that? Or maybe they're going to count on you to get a diagnosis. A simple home sleep study can be ordered online directly by the consumer or you for under $200. Sleep at home in your bed and figure out of the hierarchy of food, water, air. Well, which one do you live the shortest period of time without? Air. So let's make sure they're oxygenated. And if we look here, we see what happens in the peer review literature. They point out that with hypoxia, whether it be wearing a mask or having your tourniquet on, we're going to see changes in inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, all because of hypoxia. And we know that fibrinogen, we can measure this as we're looking at cardiovascular profiles. It's a clotting risk factor. But if you have apnea, you're more likely to clot. And remember, 38,000 people a year die in their sleep. But the reason I share this is oxygen, oxidation, phosphorylation, that citric acid cycle. Simple things to support the body. And if you look over here, you'll see 500 enzymatic pathways, which are NAD dependent, cellular metabolism 2018, and look at all these pathways and all these things that are NAD dependent, the fertility, the fatty liver, insulin resistance. But oh, I thought insulin resistance was just because I eat too many carbs. And yeah, sure, if you eat lots of carbs, you're going to accelerate that process. But the reality is, look at all these risk factors, which are NAD enzyme dependent. And if we can level the playing field and take some of that variable out, is leveling the playing field for us as clinicians. And this is an obstacle, as we say in naturopathic medicine, tola causam, address the cause. And we know NAD levels are dropping with age. So why wouldn't we address the cause, knowing that there's all these other secondary benefits, even without measuring NAD? Just like, why wouldn't we take it as any other supplement on a daily basis? So we have to make choices about how do we help maintain biological age. So I was born in 1965. I have a chronological age, but then I have a biological age. Well, I underwent and endured sleep apnea for many years before I knew I had it, and I was a thin guy that wasn't fitting all the stereotypes. And it's like, so how low did my oxygen levels go? My oxygen levels went down to 65% oxygen at night. Oh, well, how many events did you have, Chris? Well, I had 58 events an hour, 58 times of underbreathing or not breathing. So what was the sequelae of that? Well, what happens if a child had tonsil problems or adenoid problems? What's happening to that kiddo? Are they having mitochondrial challenges? And so once again, we want to look at making that decision for our patients of, do we help them down the journey? And at that fork in the road of, do we just give them more ashwagandha, more thyroid support, more maybe thyroid hormone, or maybe we give them Cortef, or maybe we give them hormone replacement therapy, bioidentical hormones, or do we also start supporting the tissues at a fundamental level? And we know that ATP, once again, that whole citric acid cycle, NAD, and many other nutrient dependent, well, we create our nucleic acids. And we can say all the methylation in the world, but if we're not creating the nucleic acids, we're not creating the building blocks for our DNA, we're going to have a problem. And then once again, ATP is typically in mitochondrial aspect, oxphos catalytic enzyme, the ATP synthase. And at any given moment in time, we have 0.1 moles of ATP. And remember back to our chemistry, that's not a whole lot. And then every cell requires the hydrolysis of 200 to 300 moles of ATP, every cell. And so like, okay, we don't have a whole lot of resting energy, but look at here, each ATP molecule is recycled 2,000 to 3,000 times a day. Well, okay, that's a lot of CoQ10, that's a lot of B vitamins, and that's a whole heck of a lot of NAD that we need to have in order to support that. Once again, cellular function and healing. So to the question, how many cells in our body have to be tired, and how low does our NAD or ATP levels have to be before we have low thyroid function, before we have adrenal fatigue, before we have gonadal function? And let me pause there. Yes, you may have Hashimoto's. Yes, some of my patients have Graves' disease. But now the question is, there is a pathophysiology or not, no question about it. But your body still has to, at those tissue levels, go ahead and be supportive. How about polycystic ovary disease? And so that would be a good example. Well, I use metformin, I use this herb or that herb. Yeah, we can do that, but those tissues have to have the energy to take up the therapeutics we're giving them, vitamins, minerals, nutrients, drugs, RXs. And so once again, how much sleep deprivation or hypoxia? Likewise, how bad an infection has to occur before we blow through our NAD levels. There's a study showing that NAD levels drop precipitously within 25 hours after a viral infection starts ensuing. And that was modeled out. So the question is, how tired is my brain before my brain's not working? How tired is my heart before I have congestive heart failure or a broken heart like Takotsubo's? And once again, mitochondrial function. All the things we know. I'm trying to dovetail after my 30 years of clinical experience. What are some of the things we've been treating unbeknownst to the fact that we've been treating them? And I think we've been treating the mitochondria all the way along, but we've been missing the NAD component in my estimation. So once again, drops with time, critical for energy, promoting cellular health. Low NAD levels contribute to feeling tired. Yes, a person with chronic fatigue or a person chronically fatigued or fatigued chronically might have cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr virus. Maybe you're battling Lyme and you're dealing with a Lyme patient or a whole series of Lyme patients. They still need to have the mitochondria to rebuild, have resilience, and restore. So NAD is critical for bioenergetics. NAD is critical for helping with the age-related pathways. NAD depletions emerge as a fundamental aspect of cellular and aging in general, and we need to support those levels. But now CrossFit and working out. What happens if a person's doing really, really well and they decide to really work out hard and they work out and for 6 months they're doing great and they're getting buff and ripped, but now they're creating this anabolic process. They're pushing that pathway. They're ensuring the branching amino acids and essential amino acids are going down. But now we're building. That takes energy as well. Not only does it take energy to work out, it takes energy to once again rebuild and restore. NAD is great for athletes. And I had a gentleman in his early 30s, totally ripped, an 8-pack. Why stop at 6 when you can have 8? He's just an Adonis of a gentleman in terms of his body type and what he's done. He actually ended up in the hospital, rhabdomyolysis, not from being on a statin drug, not from anything. He overworked in his CrossFit. And I mean, his workouts are amazing. It's on YouTube. And it's like, wow, I mean, this guy is just going for it. He pushed his body too far. So once again, we're pushing our body. Well, what happens if we don't have the extreme athlete, but what happens if we have the person trying to detoxify and detoxify from toluene or benzene or heavy metals? Well, we have to support the phase 1 and phase 2 of the liver detox and the other pathways as well. So the aging process happens. NAD levels drop precipitously, as you can see from this 2012 article. And what we're seeing here is all those classical signs. And now the question is, lower NAD, more obesity, more muscle problems, more sarcopenia, and once again, poor outcome as a result, all in the peer review literature. And once again, we started with talking about nicotinamide riboside, but we're also talking about just nicotinic acid, and it's making the peer review literature here in 2021. Why? Because it's that germane. And so when we look at mitochondrial dysfunction, remember these slides will be available for you. So after our presentation, they'll be emailed to each of you, and you're welcome to use them as a point of reference. And when I put these together, having written a book on the mitochondria, the more I look into the human body, the more I'm back to that childhood awe of like, are we not amazingly put together? But look at all these functionalities, brain issues, migraines, strokes, autism, dementia, developmental delays, eye issues, heart issues, liver, muscle, nerve, pancreatic issues, all can be related in part. Doesn't have to be the whole equation, but mitochondrial dysfunction. But let's control this part and allow all the rest of our therapeutics to work better. Likewise, sometimes our patients come in, and that's where our lovely little functional medicine history comes in. Like, well, tell me about the medicines you're on. Well, I also want to know what the medicines you've been on, and not just the ones that, okay, well, these are the drug allergies you have, but I want to know, have you taken analgesics in the past, or a whole lot of Tylenol before you had that surgery? Well, yes. Well, have you had a whole lot of medical procedures, that GI procedure, or another one where you did a twilight or anesthesia, or lots of dental procedures with lidocaine? Well, of course, once again, that can actually poison the mitochondria. This is per the 2008 research. John Neufeld, a naturopathic doctor, actually submitted this to the peer review literature back in 2008. And we're seeing antidepressants, antibiotics. If we were to look at an updated version from the 2008, we'd add the fluoxetines to that list as well, with those black box warnings. And we get the antidepressants. Well, we got those extra little fluoride molecules to push out iodine from the brain and the thyroid and alter the pineal gland, that along with the fluoridated water. And so once again, we're seeing all these burdens. That sleep meds would fall into this category, the benzos as well. It's like, okay, have patients been on the sleep meds? Well, we're going to cause some problems. Cholesterol meds we're familiar with. Of course, diabetic meds, metformin, we know causes a B12 deficiency, but it also, of course, increases chance of neuropathy once we have B12. And once again, nerves need the mitochondrial support as well. And of course, the conditions which we classically see in our clinical practices. Oh, mitochondrial dysfunctions, Alzheimer's, anxiety, of course, cancer. There's a common theme here, but if we don't fuel ourselves, we all know this. I'm not preaching. I'm preaching to the choir maybe, but you guys will say this exactly the same thing. It's like, darn, I see all of that. And it makes sense that you have to have cellular energy, but exercise intolerance, how do you get a body in motion? Well, body motion stays in motion, so a body at rest stays at rest, a body motion stays in motion, but it's like, how do we break that inertia? Well, we have to support the body. And so we're starting to see here again and again that things like exercise stimulate the sirtuins and also help increase NAD levels as well. So exercise is good, we know that. Well, hey, there's an article showing it. And at the same time, while we're supplementing our nicotinamide riboside to support the NAD, we're also going to do things like exercise and great diet. So once again, you supplement a good diet. And so we see here the normal aging process, obesity, starting to see the changes in lipid accumulation. Oh, I thought that was a drug deficiency, or I thought that was a sustained release niacin, or a plant phytonutrient deficiency, or maybe I needed more fiber. It could also be related to the mitochondria. And we know also with lower thyroid function, we're also going to have higher lipid issues, more insulin resistance. And you see that routinely. You're like, okay, I have elevated lipids, elevated glucose, elevated liver enzymes. I wonder what the thyroid is. Is it dialed in on the TSH free T3, free T4? And we're going to get to that. So I'm going through these slides quickly. Remember this being recorded because you know most of this already. So NAD, we want to fuel the body and every cell in the body, inner ear, pancreatic, kidney. Well, that's kind of like our patients. That's their bodies. We have to, once again, have the NAD and the mitochondrial support. So as we see here, nuclear DNA damage signaling to the mitochondria and aging. emerging evidence suggests a crucial role for signaling from the nucleus to the mitochondria in regulating mitochondrial function and aging. And on an immune lecture that's going to be coming up from John Salerno, Dr. John Salerno, he's going to be speaking about immune function and the mitochondria and NAD. And we now know that the mitochondria within our cells themselves is like, they actually have something called MAVs, and that's a membrane molecule that actually detects virals and viral signaling and actually tells the mitochondria to start producing regulatory components for cytokines. It's like, what? So once again, absolutely totally amazing. So Dr. John's presentation is going to be remarkable coming up in September. And so once again, look at the signaling, look at what's happening, the transduction, dysfunction, neurodegeneration. And remember that riddle, what walked on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, 3 legs in the evening, and no legs at night, humankind. And that's the process, but can we slow that process and can we add health to the years? And that's our goal. And you can't really go wrong in my mind's eye from all the research I've done by supporting the mitochondria. So we want to support our genetic capacity, and in that human awe side of things, to print the human DNA would take more than 3,000 books with 1,000 pages, taking 9 years to read. The entire instruction guide is written in code, which we know, ATGC, and their companion on the other side. Like, wow. But once again, we have to fuel the reading of that Library of Congress, Alexandria Library, and say, well, how do I support that? Mitochondrial support. So we get to thyroid now. We're going to get to the clinical side of things. Well, receptors for glucocorticosteroids, estrogens, androgens, and thyroid hormone have been detected in the mitochondria of various cells. Okay, so it's a yin-yang, teeter-totter, catch-22. We need the glucocorticosteroids, the hormones, thyroid, for the mitochondria to work, and then the mitochondria create the energy for those end tissues to create the hormones. So once again, we're seeing that correlation that we take care of the mitochondria, and then of course we're going to make a more optimal level of hormone, all things being equal, unless there's dysfunction within the end tissues, and we're going to actually see improvement. And so they go on to say, recent evidence points to a role mitochondrial receptors in cell survival and apoptosis exerted by genomic and non-genomic mechanisms. So very, very intriguing to say the least. But then we get to our human metronome. What is our human metronome? It is our thyroid gland. It's our tick-tock. We know that. And I was just visiting with a 19-year-old young man that's a pianist. He's off to University of Washington. And we were talking about metronomes. And of course, he knew it very well. So we were talking about thyroid function and growth hormone, some of the challenges he was dealing with. But as you can see where the red arrow is, the conclusion, this study suggests that the mitochondrial OXPHOS defect may cause structural and functional changes of thyrocytes, so thyroid cells, which lead to the progression of chronic non-autoimmune failure of the thyroid gland. So the aging process of our thyroid gland, TSH going up, all these other things. Now you can only imagine in a Hashimoto's circumstance where we have thyroid peroxidase and more free radical damage. But then we look at the graphic at the right-hand upper corner, we see T3 hormone, and the T3 hormone, what does it do? It actually goes down directly to the mitochondrial DNA T3 receptor. That's not reverse T3, that's a T3 receptor on the mitochondria. So now it's saying, hey, I'm going to have you work harder. But now imagine we have a patient, hypothyroid, and we say, oh, we're going to give you some Armour-thyroid, Nature-thyroid, West-thyroid, Cytomel, levothyroxine, Synthroid, you name it. And we're going to create stimulation to the mitochondria. Does that mitochondria have all the CoQ10 and carnitine and PQQ and NAD and cofactors to start speeding up, or was it muddling along to start with? So do we, with our thyroid patients, knowing we're going to create mitochondrial stimulation, do we give them nicotinamide riboside to support the NAD along with CoQ10 and other cofactors? Yes, it only makes good sense from the storyline that I've been sharing from the peer review literature. And then on top of it, in the peer review literature, we realize that why do some of our patients say, doc, could it be that my thyroid stopped working? I felt really good for a week or two and I felt really crummy now. Well, it's either you've blown through your mitochondrial reserve and you went through a rate limiting factor. So great, you're low on making chocolate chip cookies, or you're low on chocolate chips or brown sugar or flour or vanilla, whatever it might be. You've burnt through a nutrient And once again, with the aging process, we know NAD is a key likelihood of that. But the first thing is we speed up the restoration, which happens very quickly with thyroid therapy. The second problem is 1 to several days after we start doing thyroid hormone. And yes, we measure 4 to 6 weeks to see the plateau of T4 when we give levothyroxine. But we start seeing the shift at the infinitesimal level, at the cell level, very quickly. And what we see is there's an increased mitochondrial biogenesis and then change in the mitochondrial mass. So the big question, the $64,000 question is, are we supporting the NAD and mitochondrial levels for our thyroid patients? Because we're asking them to speed up everything, including the mitochondria. And so we see all these different changes that occur with thyroid hormones, changes the modification of the inner membrane, and we're seeing changes in the uncoupling of oxidative phosphorylation. It's like, wow, I never thought of that, to be honest with you, before I started doing this research, looking like, well, if I give thyroid, this is what I expect. We all do this. But now it's a ripple effect. And of course, now imagine we speed up the thyroid, so now everything's coming by as faster, and we're no longer going 30 miles an hour, we're doing 55 miles an hour. But now what has to happen? Well, we have to have not only our thyroid and all the nutrients to get the job done, as you can see here, as borrowed from the IFM, Institute for Functional Medicine. It's a lecture I gave for them. I was giving adrenal, thyroid, and male lectures for a couple of years with IFM. And you can see, like, darn, look at all the nutrients, all the complexity. But then we go to adrenal. So now we are going from 30 miles an hour to 55 miles an hour. And now everything's coming by like a bug on a windshield. Well, how is the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex going? Remember the wired and tired? Well, the wired parts, of course, epi and norepi from the medulla, which most of us don't treat the adrenal medulla nearly as much as we could. We're treating cortisol levels and those aspects. And of course, we also have aldosterone. But what we're seeing here is the review of the study at the very bottom in the highlight. It says, we aim to highlight with this review the shift in stereogenic cell biology from a focus of actions of individual proteins in isolation to the action of protein assemblies working together to execute cellular function. And they're finding out that the mitochondria are the epicenter for all of this. And we're going to find out in a moment what happens at the gonadal level. And when we look at the Leydig cell, it is absolutely mind-blowing. So when we think of adrenal support, we think, okay, we're going to go ahead and give adrenal DHEA, adaptogens like ashwagandha, rhodiola. But what about nicotinamide riboside, CoQ10, and PQQ to support the energy of those cells, as you can see histologically on the left-hand side? It now makes sense. And now we look at the Leydig cell, right-hand upper corner, and we're seeing, well, luteinizing hormone goes down to Leydig cell. Could it be an ovarian cell? It could be an adrenal cell. It could be a thyroid cell. But look what happens. Cholesterol within the Leydig cell, testicular cell, goes into the mitochondria and makes pregnenolone, which is the beginning of all the stereogenesis of all our steroidal hormones. So if the mitochondria is not properly fueled, will they do a good job of making pregnenolone? And will the great grandmother of all our hormones that everything comes from on the steroidal hormone side of things be a rate limiting factor? So we're starting to see that the steroidal hormone biosynthesis begins in the mitochondria, but it also starts impacting cytochrome 450 pathways, can also start impacting drug metabolism. Think of liver, phase 1, phase 2, and all the cytokines. So once again, cholesterol, pregnenolone, and the mitochondria. So then we get to the aging process. Research shows that for us that are doing bioidentical hormones, are we just merely giving a hormone estradiol or bias or testosterone or some blend? And so how it works, because we're making the body more normal, whatever normal is these days. Like, okay, well, yeah, kind of, sort of, but it's actually working a crosstalk between the mitochondria and is actually helping the mitochondria be healthier to help with the skin. Because after all, you're trying to replump. Let's say you've been low on estrogen for a while and you're doing atrophic vaginitis or cosmeceutical estrogen therapeutics. You're helping the skin become more robust. But the skin doesn't become robust because, well, there's estrogen now in those cells. It's because it's helping the mitochondria. Likewise for male function as well. So then we see the GI side of things. And we have sick people all the time with more gut issues than ever. Their guts are killing them. 70% of serotonin in the gut. 70 to 80% of our immune system in our gut. We know that. We have the microbiome, our little world of 100 trillion microbiota, which number as much, if not more, than the cells of our body. So we give glutamine, we give inositylglucosamine, we fuel the butyrate levels, probiotics, but are we giving the villi, the brush border enzymes, the colonocytes, sufficient nicotinamide riboside, CoQ10, and mitochondrial support? And the answer is no. And they're saying here, mitochondrial disorders are very much linked to GI problems. So, and if we're not absorbing our nutrients, what's going to happen? So then we get to, of course, fueling our pathways. With nicotinamide riboside, there's sirtuins, there's PARPs, there's CD38s, as example of pathways that are NAD dependent. But at the same time, look at all these other aspects of our being, including inflammation, which of course, more patients than ever now know things that they probably ought not have known. They know about IgG, IgM, cytokines. They have dug into the literature because of the viral issues and news for the last almost 2 years. And now they've Googled themselves even into more of a frenzy. But once again, hopefully they come across the fact that supporting the NAD pathway, like with nicotinamide riboside, is going to support them across the board. Going back to the basics, fuel the body, and inherently, most of the time, the body knows what to do. And at that note, this is actually from a monograph from True Niagen. You can request it, and you can see human studies are in the blue dots: liver changes, brain changes, skin changes, blood plasma changes, cataracts, once again, the eye, red blood cells. Well, look what happens. When you get a viral infection also, NAD levels drop. And at the same time, there's a lot of popularity now of how do I support NAD? Well, there's some limitations. Giving niacin causes flushes. Plus, you have to go through all those pathways. NAM inhibits sirtuins. We don't want to be inhibiting sirtuins. Critical enzymatic nutrient pathway in our body that we have to fuel properly and nourish properly. Tryptophan, very inefficient, 60-to-1 ratio. We've talked about that. But then we get to nicotinamide riboside, most effective, most efficient, and it's actually been shown in the peer-reviewed literature, clinical and preclinical, to be the way to go. It doesn't cause the flushing, does not inhibit sirtuins, and when we get stressed physiologically, the NRK pathway actually is stimulated during high demand. So the NR goes through that pathway, and NR doesn't have the limitations that other substances may have, like NMN. So once again, we want to support those pathways. So with that said, lots of research on True Niagen. It's a product that I use. I would use it if I was not educating for them. I have my entire family on it. Why? Because with the aging process, we need to support our NAD levels. Dosages can be 300 or 500. I use the professional 500 dose. And the question is, why do I do that? Where is the literature? Well, the literature is very clear. 8-week randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled parallel arm. You can see the graph on the right-hand upper corner, and you're seeing 140 healthy, whatever healthy is, overweight adults. They were given 100, 300, or 1,000 milligrams. They measured kinetics, and they saw that at 300 milligrams, there was a 51% increase in whole blood NAD. Remembering that's about a 50% drop in the skin of NAD by the mid-40s, which is probably reflective of whole body levels, but it's definitely the skin. And then we see increase was maintained for 8 weeks. So it's like, take it, keep it going, and you're doing great. At 1,000 milligrams, you have 142% increase. Once again, it was sustained. I personally take 500 daily. I have my patients take 500. If they have a viral illness, I bump up to 1,000 because we know the levels drop precipitously. Once again, Dr. John Salerno is going to be speaking on that in September. So we want to look at what can we expect. Patients generally feel more energy. They generally feel a little bit better. Now, they have to work on their diet and their lifestyle. There's no magic pill, and no one's ever going to pretend that there is. But if you remove the obstacles, and I tell my patients all the time, if you're walking around a track with a friend and there's hurdles out there because the hurdlers were just practicing, well, of course, if you had to walk around or over each of those hurdles, it's going to make your walk with your friend very slow. But the moment we start removing those hurdles for our patients on the journey of wellness, we speed up the process. And not having sufficient NAD and therefore, as a result, not having enough nicotinamide riboside to actually support that, absolutely critical. The other thing is a penny saved is a penny earned. So of course, addressing things that are burning and abusing the mitochondria, procedures, medications that could be impacting the mitochondria. Also, once again, we're going to help replenish the health savings account and the bank reserve of NR and the NAD levels. So once again, what we're looking at here is Niagen has the approval of being used as a GRAS substance in Canada, Australia, United States. And if you look at the comparisons, 10 plus published studies, it activates sirtuins and promotes cellular health. No known negative effects, FDA safety notified and preferred during times of metabolic stress. And I think we all qualify these days. So every nucleated cell needs to have, of course, NAD. All organs require it. And once again, competent immune system is NAD dependent. And without NAD, once again, any cell in our body is just not going to function. We would die, literally. And so add health to your years. Adrenal support is NAD dependent. Our thyroid support is NAD dependent. And fertility and pregnancy outcome is NAD dependent. Kind of describing all our patients, right? I've worked family practice for the last 30 years here in Oregon. It's like, yeah, that kind of covers most of my patients. You know, you throw in GI health here too. Whole body, NAD dependent. So we want to support the citric acid electron transport chain, NAD. So once again, nicotinamide riboside is the way I choose to. And of course, we all have choices and we all make educated choices. I have made a very educated choice looking at all the literature ad nauseum. We want to supplement a healthful diet. And once again, NAD, substrates, nicotinamide riboside, and boom, boom. Remember all those little stars? NAD. Why can I make such a bold statement as an independent educator about nicotinamide riboside and NAD? NAD, you need it for each of these steps. If you don't have that, you don't have the citric acid cycle, don't have the citric acid cycle, we don't have energy. Yes, CoQ10, carnitine, ribose, PQQ, other things I also love in my clinical practice. So I'm going to open up for questions. Greg is available. He's a VP of True Niagen Chromatics. And so you can email at practitioner@TrueNiagen. Remember, slides will be coming to you as a participant.